Okay, I'm gonna do economic rent, okay? So, go back to the beginning here. I'm gonna do a little thing on rents, profits, financial environment of business. Stock market, this is from a few years ago, it's 2012, but it really applies today. So what happened in 2009, you can kind of see parallels to 1929, 20s, but you can also see parallels to today. There was a big recession in 1920 that nobody knows about because the government didn't do anything and it recovered very quickly. But, so what I want to do is I want to do economic rent. Economic rent and rent that we pay as individuals is very different. These are two different ideas. So economic rent is a payment for a resource above its opportunity cost. So for example, let's say you pay $2,000 a month. I know you guys are down there, so you don't pay that much, but that's like a very cheap apartment in Seattle. We pay about that in Bellevue for a pretty decent place. And so anyways, say it's $2,000 and the opportunity cost for the owner of that apartment, he could get it to somebody else for $1,500 or something like that, and you're paying $2,000. The economic rent would be the difference between what the owner of the resource, the apartment, could get and what he actually gets. So I'm gonna go a little more detail because we'll talk about athletes and actors and stuff because that's where this idea really applies. But we'll come back to this. But just remember that's the definition. It's not rent that we usually think of rent. It's very different. So different meaning in economics. So originally they used it to, like we do. I want to borrow your property or something for perhaps a year or so. So I'm going to rent it. And the concept of economic rent was David Ricardo. He was a British guy. He's famous for his debates on the Corn Laws, where he was against the Corn Laws, which was the reason that the Irish potato famine was so terrible and it killed so many people was massive tariffs. They would not allow cheap food to be imported. And England was the same way. They had this Corn Laws, they had these huge tariffs, and David Ricardo, he's the guy that came up with comparative advantage, reasons nations should trade, and why tariffs are not a good idea. So we'll come back to that. Okay, so here's an example. So let's say you have the demand curve here, price per unit, you've got some economic rent. This is at a zero price. You've got a fixed supply of land. This is where the market is demanding it. This is actually more like what you would be willing to get rid of it for. This is what it actually goes for. The difference being the economic rent, quantity times price. Okay, we'll come explain this in more details. And as the demand for the product in the marketplace rises, you're able to achieve more economic rent. So an apartment back in Seattle, just like 5 years ago, was going for very low price. And as demand, so they were obviously willing to rent out like a 1-bedroom apartment. My friend had a pretty nice studio in an old building, big, and he was paying $800 a month. So they were willing to rent that out for $800 a month. But that probably goes for $1,500 a month now. So if they were willing to rent it out for $800, but the market says they're getting $1,500, the difference there would be their economic rent, what they're willing to, their opportunity cost in many cases, even what they're willing to rent it out versus what they actually rent it out. And then as the market increases, demand increases, they're able to achieve higher economic rent levels. The economic rent as an idea is very applicable to professional sports superstars. So I'm in Seattle, Russell Wilson gets $22 million a year. What do you think he would be willing to work for? Or let's say he went and played for the Yankees. That's kind of his opportunity cost. If he somehow the Seahawks nobody wanted to pay him as a quarterback, he decides to go play baseball, he could probably get a few $100,000 a year to start off. Because he's a superstar, but he's not a baseball star. He's only a baseball star because he's a football star. But if he wasn't a football star, what would he get? And let's say they give him $1 million a year to play baseball. that his economic rent is the difference between the 22 million he gets in football and his opportunity cost of 1 million, right? So that's pretty big. Rock stars, what's the opportunity cost of a rock star who has no education and no skills except playing a musical instrument? Pretty low. Movie stars, movie stars are not known for their intellect. Not insulting them, because there's some pretty good ones out there. I have some fan of some, but if Tom Cruise wasn't a movie star, what would he do? I don't know. What's his opportunity cost, right? He gets a lot of economic rent. That $15-20 million a film he gets, he would not get anywhere near that if he went into the real world, right? Models, $10,000-$20,000 a shoot a day, so they're not going to make that in the real world, right? Inventors and innovators. So the definition of economic rent to the phenomenal earnings these people make, right? And no doubt, so again, back to Russell Wilson, would he work for less? Probably. So even if he were playing football, he worked for $600,000, that was his rookie contract. So he was clearly willing to work for less than $1 million, but he gets $22 million. So he gets a huge economic rent there, right? Much of his rent occurs because Russell Wilson has a resource that cannot be replicated very well. And one could even say Russell Wilson is a monopoly and he's charging too much for his product, right? So we'll get into that monopolies. Remember that. So I might talk about that later. Russell Wilson, the monopoly. The government needs to come in and make Russell Wilson play for other teams, right? It's only fair. So, but he has, the Seahawks are, I'm not a big fan, but I'm a college football guy. Go Ducks, go Cougs, go Tigers, Auburn, other schools. But much of the rent occurs because Russell Wilson he has a very specific talent, right? So he is a slippery guy. So if you watch him, he does a great job of evading tacklers, right? The Seahawks have, I don't know why they even have an offensive line. They can't stop anybody. So he drops back and he just slides away from people and he makes pretty amazing plays. Very few can duplicate what he does. So he's able to demand a high value. Not only that, but once he started doing that, then he got a big fan base. And so if you were to trade Wilson for even a Drew Brees or somebody, the fan base would not be very happy, especially given their age difference. So economic rent and the allocation of resources. Why is economic rent so important? Economic rent, it's a price, right? It's just a function of the price system. So economic rent allocates resources to their highest valued use. And what it does is it brings a lot of resource forth into the market that otherwise may not be available, right? So for instance, if you guys are probably Mission Impossible fans, maybe, Tom Cruise is great in those movies, right? And if he were not to get the kind of money that they offered him for those movies, he would go do something else. But the Mission Impossible movies make a lot of money, and so they're willing to pay him a lot of money. And so what economic rent does is it brings that resource, the Tom Cruise resource, into the movie in which he is most valuable. What kind of value does Tom Cruise apply in maybe a romantic comedy of sort, like Jerry Maguire, right? Good value, but he is an action star. So Arnold Schwarzenegger, let's go do a Terminator 7. What are they on? 5, I think. So to get him to do another one versus Junior, or Kindergarten Cop, which that was a pretty good movie, funny, but his value as a movie star is in action films. That's the kind of actor he is. And so if people were bidding for his time, the action film would be able to bid higher because they realize the value he gives to the movie is much greater than it would be in some other kind of movie. And so it allocates that resource to its highest valued use. So in our world, for example, let's think of beef or steel, concrete, what kind of use would steel and concrete have? Well, you could build a house with it, but you could build a house with wood and other things too, right? And so the things that you really need steel and concrete to build, like buildings and roads and sidewalks and things like that, they will bid concrete and steel up to a price to where a person building a house says, it's not really worth it. I think I'll just find a substitute good. And so that valued resource goes to where it is most needed, which is in the roads and the buildings and things like that. Right. So how much can be attributed to economic rent? Well, there's no real way to tell because we don't know where else Tom Cruise could actually go if he wasn't a superstar, right? But we know that it would be less, right? We can be we know it would be less because he went to whoever gave him the most money. And so the other people offered him less money. So they probably have a very high accumulated wealth and also a more jaded outlook about their work. It's therefore not clear how much they would work for if they were not offering those huge sums of money. I mean, Tom Cruise, if you didn't give him 20 million or whatever he demands, would he work? He probably gets a lot of value out of some of the movies he plays, but he's also worth 100, 200, I don't know how much, some ungodly amount of money. And so would he work if you offered him $1 million? No way he'd work, right? You and me, we'd work for $1 million. What do you want me to do, right? So even if some superstars would work for less, forces allow them to make much more income anyway. Right? So here you have some people this is from back then. Now look at Oprah Winfrey, talk show host, owner, author, she's got her own network, all those things. $315 million, do you think she would have worked for less? I'm pretty sure she would have, right? So, etc. Bruckheimer, he produces all these TV shows, CSI, things like that. Spielberg, George Lucas, of course, and Beyonce, the top musician, AC/DC and U2, top rock groups from that time. Right now, Taylor Swift, right? Taylor Swift makes something like $100 million a year or something, some ridiculous amount of money, right? So firms or businesses, like individuals, seek the highest possible rent for their product. Firms and businesses are like resources. They are valued for what they offer people, right? For what they offer society. So, and they also, in themselves, are hiring out individuals and labor and things like that, right? Come on. Oh, there you go. So, in order to produce a product or service, they hope they can sell at a profit. Right? So here you have a firm, normally operates at least one plant, etc. They employ resources, produce goods or services for a profit. You've got 3 different types. Skip over this. I'll let you guys look at this. Sole proprietorship. That's one person owns his own business. That's what actually I believe that's what the majority of businesses are. You can think of like a landscaping business, something like that. Okay. An LLC or some type of limited liability corporation. That could actually be a sole proprietorship type, but he wants to incorporate and when you incorporate, you limit the liability. So you kind of separate your personal assets from your business assets, whereas a sole proprietorship, usually they're one big thing. So if somebody sues you or you do something terrible, you can lose your house. Partnerships, See, disadvantages, you get dividends, but they're coming from the after-tax money of a corporation, and then they're taxed again. So remember double taxation when they talk about dividends and investors. The capital gains tax is only 15%. Well, it's like 45% because it comes from after-tax income of the corporation. So, anyways, remember we talked about profit, so you guys should remember that. Accounting profit versus economic profit. Accounting profit just takes into account explicit costs, which is like rent, money you actually spend. Economic profit talks about implicit costs. So if you own your own building, you have to account for what you could rent it out for. The opportunity cost of having your own business in your own building, right? Normal rate of return. This is the opportunity cost of capital. So if I have let's say I have a building, I'm running a business out of it, I have to think of what is a normal rate of return for that business that I'm running, the money I'm putting into the business, which could include the money that I'm not getting because I'm not renting out my building, right? So I need to make sure that if I'm going to operate, I should obtain a normal rate of return. I should be able to, at least in my business, I should be able to at least get what I could get if I just stuck the money in some other form of investment. What the normal rate of return does is it's a measuring point. It's a point at which a person can decide whether or not he wants to stay in business. You know, is it worthwhile investing in this business, or should I get out of it because I'm not earning normal rate of return? I'm getting less money than I could if I went into another investment, right? Again, kind of the idea of economic rent. If I could get economic rent from a different place, maybe I should go do that. And because there's an opportunity cost of capital. And again, this is a single owner or sole proprietorship. They're usually thinking of only explicit costs, but they need to think of what they could be. You know, here's a mechanic. He's got his own service station, and he's not taking into account the fact that of his time, but the fact that he owns the station and maybe he could be renting it out to somebody else. He could sell it and earn a rate of return on it from investment from the money that he gets from the station. So, you know, I mean, if you go to a big city and you're looking at parking lots, things like that, what's the rate of return on a parking lot? Could they sell the parking lot to a developer who builds a building, and then they can take the money they get from the parking lot and invest it? You know, these are decisions that businesses need to make. Parking garage or apartment building? Well, which one do you think is going to earn a longer rate of return over the next 20 years? Right. Going back to the other idea. So in accounting profits, actually I don't think we did talk about this yet. So again, I'm going to say accounting profits. So if you're in accounting, which some of you probably are or have been or will be, then profits in accounting are going to be in terms simply, sorry, I'm going to have to move this a little bit so I can actually see. You can see me instead of me staring at the light. Okay, so accounting profits are your total revenue minus your total cost, that's profit. But in accounting, total cost is only explicit. That means price of labor, price of rent, cost of goods, things that you actually lay money out to. Okay, economic profit, this includes implicit and explicit. So again, cost of goods, rent, wages for your labor, etc., right? And then you have to figure out, okay, what could I be doing? What is my opportunity cost? So again, I'm spending half an hour, or I'm getting $20 an hour on average doing this when I could be getting $15 an hour. Maybe I could be getting $25 an hour doing something else. So I have a negative opportunity cost, right? Or a negative profit there because my opportunity cost is greater than what I actually do. Now, this gets into to remind people that you should think of utility here. What, if I could get paid more to work for somebody else than to work for myself, should I just go and work for somebody else? I don't know, right? There is a benefit to being your own boss. There is a non-monetary benefit. So if we think strictly in terms of money, then I think you're going to have a very simplistic view of the world, right? Like maybe like a mainstream economist or something. But so I mean that's why people go into work for themselves for lower wages than they could get otherwise. It's because people enjoy doing other things, right? So you might say, in some cases that, see here, this is accounting profit, this is economic profit, because this is what I could have been doing, right? There are cases where this is up here, like your normal rate of return on investment might be much greater than your actual profit, but why would I do that? Well, if I'm getting a negative economic profit, an economic loss, but an accounting profit, I may think, you know what, I didn't like what I did before. I actually hated my job. And so I quit to go do something where I get paid less. There's examples of people quitting their $100,000 Wall Street job and going out and starting their own food truck in New York City and earning like 50, 60 a year. You think, oh, 60,000 a year, that's a $60,000 accounting profit. But because they're getting 60, they could have been making 100. That's a $40,000 economic loss. Why would you have an economic loss? Well, again, you know, money is not everything, right? So I think if everybody just said, you know what pays the most, there'd be a lot more doctors, there'd be a lot more lawyers, you know, things like that, and actually the pay would eventually go down because there'd be so many of them. But you'd have a pretty boring world. People would just be going and chasing whatever has the highest pay, and nobody would do lower paying jobs that actually provide a lot of internal benefit. Right? So I think what I do, I don't know, maybe I could go earn more money in somewhere else, but you know, I get a immeasurable benefit from what I do. So hopefully you guys enjoy it. So when you tell me that you enjoy it, I get super benefits, right? So like, wow, that's awesome. So I don't get the monetary pay, I get the satisfaction and the personal kind of growth almost, not really growth, but personal satisfaction, right? So I get paid in those ways. Whereas a desk job doesn't really pay very much in those terms. Right? So anyways, so we talked about the goal of the firm, profit maximization. Right? A firm as a collection of individuals seeking a single goal of profit as a group. Right? Theory of consumer demand, satisfaction, maximization, utility maximization is the individual. So we talked about utility maximization. Now we're talking about the firm. The firm, a corporation has, if you think of the individual and utility, they're trying to maximize utility. Utility to a firm, a corporation, which is, it's not a real thing really. It's a collection of individuals, right? So, and they have one goal, which is profit. So utility to a firm, you can think of, instead of utility, which is satisfaction individuals get, a firm, it's profit. That is utility to a firm. Firms live for profit, basically, right? They try to balance risk and return. They are trying to maximize returns, and they try to maximize expected returns. So they balance high risk, high return with low risk, low return. They try to balance those out and try to figure out at which point can I maximize my expected returns, right? Given the different levels of risk and things that I don't know. Interest is the price paid from debtors. Creditors for, interest is the price paid on loans. You borrow money or equipment, right? Businesses use financial capital to invest in physical capital. So businesses go out, they borrow money, they pay interest on the money, and they take that money and they buy capital. And in economics, when we say capital, we are talking about physical capital, like trucks, machines, different types of equipment, right? Financial capital, interest, okay. Variations in the rate of annual interest must be paid for credit. They depend on the length of the loan. So think about it. A short-term loan, it really depends, but if you look at a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage is typically going to have a higher interest rate in normal situations because than a 15-year rate, because I know less about 30 years down the road than I do 15, and actually I don't know anything about 15 years down the road, right? Most people don't remember 15 years ago what happened. They certainly have no idea what's going to happen in 15 years down the road, but 30 years is a higher risk. So it could even be, if I'm going to give an individual a loan, a 30-year loan is a much higher risk, because what could happen in 30 years? Well, your probability of dying is higher, right? I mean, even at a young age, your probability of dying in 30 years is significantly greater than your probability of dying in 15. And if the person dies, then, you know, well, I'm out of luck. Poor me. There's also handling charges. Size of the bank sometimes. A bigger bank, because they're more efficient, sometimes they allocate risk better than maybe a small town bank. They can provide a lower interest rate. They might have lower handling charges because they have one person dealing with more loans, so the average handling charge per loan is lower. Nominal versus real. Nominal is just the number. Real is when you take out anticipated rate of inflation. So again, 30 years down the road, I can anticipate inflation over the next 30 years given the past 100, but very poorly. 15 years, same thing, but maybe I could say my anticipation of the inflation rate in 15 years is much lower. Is a little bit more accurate. You know, I could actually go 15 years and readjust, and in 15-year increments or something. But a 30-year increment doesn't really, that's just way too far for me to have any idea what's going on. You know, you can think of a developing country. I could get an idea of what maybe a China is going to look like in 15 years, but what is China going to look like in 30? Boy, I don't know. I remember they gave over Hong Kong with the idea that in 50 years it'd be a democracy. In 15 years, it's unlikely. In 30 years, maybe, I don't know. Who knows, right? So we can say the nominal or market rate of interest is approximately equal to the real rate of interest plus anticipated inflation, right? So there you go. So there's the nominal. So the real interest rate is therefore nominal minus anticipated, right? And what the interest rate does is it allocates loanable funds, which are resources, to those people who most desire them, who think that so if I have two businesses and one thinks that he's going to get a 10% rate of return and one thinks he's going to get a 5% rate of return, and I say, okay, I've got money here to lend, I can only lend one of you, who do you think is willing to pay more money, pay a higher interest rate to borrow the money that they need? The person that is going to get a 10% or that's going to get a 5% rate of return, right? Clearly the 10% guy, he's willing to pay 7%. The guy that's going to get a 5% rate of return will probably not pay more than 3%, because you got to have that profit window plus margin of error. So it allocates resources to those, to where they are most valued. Remember that? Allocating financial capital in the most efficient manner, it allocates resources to their highest valued use. Compare investments cost today with the stream of future profits. You know, link present with the future, that's present value. So trying to figure out what's the future value of money today. $100 today, what is it going to be worth in 15 years? And I try to figure out, given an interest rate and all that, so what would I be willing to pay to receive a certain sum at some point in the future? Right? If I want to receive $100 in 5 years, how much would that $100 be worth today? Maybe $90 at 2% inflation rate, right? That's approximately. So present value does that, and here you go. Present value is just the compound interest formula in a different way. It's pretty much the same thing as 1 year. So if I were to future value 1 plus the interest rate, right? If I multiply both sides by that, I get present value, or you can think of it as principal times 1 plus the interest rate. See if I can do this. Well, principal times 1 plus the interest rate equals future value. That's just compound interest formula. If I multiply both sides by that 1 plus I, and I raise it to the power of number of years, that's all it is. It's just a different way of looking at the compound interest formula. So don't worry too much about that, just understand the idea. You know, this is, again, in 10 years, I'm thinking I want a certain amount of money in 10 years, how much do I have to invest today, given an interest rate? So here, in 1 year at 5%, I want to have $105 at the end of the year, or I would have to invest $100 today, right? Present value of $105 in 1 year, given a 5% real interest rate, the present value of that is $100, so it's not, there you go. 2 years, okay? So here we just have the compound interest formula right here. So we have the principal times 1 plus the interest rate raised to the power of the number of years is equal to the amount in 2 years. And here for the present value, they just kind of reverse that, okay? But in 2 years at 5%, 2 years from now, I need $105 to buy whatever it is. How much do I have to invest today at 5% to make sure that I have $105 in 2 years? $95.24. Right? There's a chart, discounting. You know, there's another thing. Why don't people save more? Well, people discount the future at different, well, and they do it at different rates, right? $1 today is not worth $1 a year from now, because not only because the rate of interest and inflation and things, but also because there is just something about the fact that I can actually spend $1 today versus the theory, the idea that I can spend $1 in a year from now, assuming I'm around, right? And I think everybody assumes they'll be around in a year, but your own personal rate is determined by how willing you are to save and borrow. It's your own. Everybody discounts the future at different rates. You know, people that live paycheck to paycheck tend to discount the future very, very highly. What would it take to get someone like that to save? They might need a really high interest rate or an intervention of some sort. Right? I'm talking about healthcare legislation in another class. And 2010, the idea was to reduce companies can deduct from their federal taxes by providing prescription drug benefits for retirees. So what it did is reduce U.S. companies' discounted present value of anticipated after-tax profits. Dutch East India Company sold stock, bonds. Share of stock, you know, it's a legal claim on a share of a corporation, sort of. Not really, good luck. You know, I mean, yes, you have a right to vote, but you're 1 in 1.5 million or whatever. You got 1 Apple stock, you're 1 in, like, I don't know how many shares are out there. And you can be forced to sell it too, so I believe. A bond, it's just a debt instrument. It's a legal claim against the firm